This is the first video in a three-part series examining identity within the context of transitioning to college. This video will focus on personal and social identity. The second video will focus on identity saliency, visibility, and the intersection of identities. And finally, the third video will address intentional engagement with identity during the transition to college. There are three main objectives to this video. We'll define personal and social identity. We'll engage in a short activity that will help us recognize different aspects of our personal and social identities. And finally, we will reflect on which aspects of our identity are more or less important to us and why that might be the case. At different moments throughout the video, I will ask you to pause the video to take some time to reflect on the questions that I post to the screen. And then once you're ready, you can hit play and rejoin the video. So here's the first opportunity to pause and reflect. Take a few minutes to jot down some notes about how you would define identity. So I'll share my definition of identity. You'll probably notice that there are aspects of my definition that reflect what you've written down, and that there may be other things that you haven't yet thought about. So I think of identity as qualities, characteristics, and descriptors that give you and others a sense of who you are. In addition, identity is what makes you unique, your personal identity, and identity is also what defines your group memberships or your social identity. And what I mean by this is that identity is not just about how we see ourselves, but identity is how other people see us, and to some degree how we want other people to see us. And in that way, social identity can be a powerful influence in our lives. Social identity creates a sense of in-group or belonging, as well as a sense of out-group or exclusion. And social identity can be an important source of pride and self-esteem, as well as power and privilege. Now that we've defined identity, take another few minutes to pause and reflect and write down the qualities, characteristics, and descriptors that we would use to define our identities. So you probably wrote down some things like gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, profession, whether it's your current profession or your future profession, interests, passions, hobbies, physical attributes, relationship to other people, etc. So let's go ahead and look at those identities a little bit more closely. So what we'll do now is we'll create personal and social identity wheels. You can download a copy of these wheels in the comments section of this video, but you can also just jot down the notes that you see on the screen. First, we'll look at personal identity wheels. Now, what you'll notice is that we have all of these different characteristics written down, and in the inner circle, where it's shaded, that's where we would write down identities that are more important or salient to us, whereas in the outer circle, we would write down identities that are less important or less salient to us. Salient is a word that means what is most relevant to us in this moment. So I'll take a few minutes to share with you some of what I wrote down in my own personal identity wheel. For profession, I wrote educator. Ever since I graduated from college, but even while I was in college, I've worked in many different capacities in educational settings. I've been a tutor, I've been a classroom teacher, I have run outdoor education programs and trained outdoor leaders. I have worked in a variety of capacities to think about college access. I've worked in admissions offices. I've also worked as an academic advisor. And to me, at the end of the day, I see myself as a lifelong learner and somebody who's always eager to help other people learn as well. I also wrote down attended private high school for critical life experience. So I grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is a small city that's very diverse. There were lots of Southeast Asian immigrants, immigrants from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic when I was growing up. So I went to school with a lot of students who were students of color, and a lot of us were from low income or lower middle class families. I went to high school in a suburban town outside of Boston that was majority white and very wealthy. And in attending that high school, I really had to shift the ways in which I interacted with people. I had to learn a whole new social code that I just was not used to. I was not used to being surrounded by so many people who did not look like me. And that has certainly shaped my perspective and how I move through this world, especially as I find myself working in a lot of different arenas that are also majority white. On the other hand, I did not put down an important identity in relation to sports teams. That actually goes in the outer circle. And that might come as a surprise given that I grew up in the Northeast and in the Boston area where people really care about their sports teams, but it's just not something I ever got into. So now take some time to create your own personal identity wheel. It'll probably take you 5 to 10 minutes. Again, you can download a copy of the wheel, or you can just grab a piece of paper, write down the categories, and then next to each one, write down your own identities and note down also which ones are more or less important to you. And then when you're ready, we'll come back and we'll begin to discuss social identity wheel. Here's the social identity wheel. As with the personal identity wheel, identities in the inner circle or shaded region are more important or salient to us, whereas those in the outer circle are less important or salient. One thing to ask yourself is why certain categories of identities fall under personal identity, whereas others appear here under social identity. I'll take a minute or so to talk about some of the things that I have written down on my own social identity wheel. For example, under legal status, I wrote U.S. citizen. Now, I know many U.S. citizens don't necessarily think about their citizenship status, but I grew up as the son of 2 immigrants from Vietnam. Both of my parents became U.S. citizens through the naturalization process, but I certainly grew up seeing things through their immigrant lens, and it's something that has shaped the way in which I see the world today. I also think about my citizenship status given the ongoing national dialogue about immigration to the United States. I think a lot about the experience of undocumented immigrants who have come to the United States to build a future for themselves, who contribute so much to our society and our economy, and yet are not seen as full citizens and don't reap the benefits of being citizens of the United States. Under health, I wrote able-bodied and good health. That's because I spend a lot of time in the outdoors. I'm very active. I love to run, bike, rock climb, hike, and so on, and I recognize that my body allows me to do those things. On the other hand, for language, I wrote English in the outer circle, and that represents my own privilege as someone who speaks English and the fact that I often don't have to think about how I am going to communicate with somebody when I meet someone new. We expect that many people learn to speak English regardless of what country they come from or what school they go to, and so communication in terms of language is not something that I have to think about very often. With that said, I did take many Spanish classes in high school and college, and I'm currently using Duolingo to try to regain my Spanish skills. So now take another 5 to 10 minutes to create your own social identity wheel, and then when you're ready, come on back for some pause and reflect. So here's a moment for us to now take a look at our personal and social identity wheels. In particular, I want you to look at why certain categories show up on one wheel versus the other, and think about what is the difference between personal and social identity. Personal identity refers to how we see ourselves. There are individual traits such as our hobbies, interests, or choices. Some will argue that personal identity are things that we can choose for ourselves, such as our hobbies, sports teams we cheer for, political views, and so on. At the same time, choice is not universal, and we know that there are limitations to where we might choose to live, the level of education we might pursue, or even the professions we choose for ourselves. Social identity, as mentioned earlier, is how others see us. They're categories that are shaped by society, by institutions such as educational institutions, hospitals. They're shaped by history, shared experiences between the different groups, and they're certainly shaped by the law and our legal institutions as well. And within our social identities, certain groups have more power and privilege, and that's something we'll think a lot more about in the next video. So in conclusion, think about these 2 questions. What aspects of your identity feel more or less important to you and why? And are there any identities you hadn't really thought about before today? And why is that?